Hey everybody, and Tony here with a review of the British horror film What Became of Jack and Jill, which was released on June 23, 1972. This film was based on Lawrence Moody's novel The Ruthless Ones. It was directed by Bill Bain. It was written by Roger Marshall. The producers were Max Rosenberg, Milton Subotsky, and Edgar J. Sherrick. The music was composed by Carl Davis. The editor was Peter Tanner. The production company in charge of this film was Amicus Productions. It was distributed in the UK by Palomar and in the USA by 20th Century Fox, and it starred Mona Washbourne, Vanessa Howard, and Paul Nicholas. I mainly stumbled upon this film by complete chance, as it also starred Vanessa Howard, who I mainly knew as Girly from Mumsy, Nanny, Sunny, and Girly. And given the premise of this film, and not to mention its title, I was quite interested in checking it out. And after watching this film in its entirety, I was not disappointed, and I actually had a fair amount of fun with this film. Story-wise, it is quite simple, but the overall execution was quite well done. This basically tells the tale of Johnny Talent, who is taking care of his sickly yet very kind grandmother, Alice. Unbeknownst to grandmother Alice, Johnny basically wants to do away with her so that he can get all of her inheritance. Enter Jill Standish, who is his girlfriend and a travel agent, who then conspires with Johnny to make this gruesome deed come to fruition. So yes, what you do see is a couple of pretty unpleasant characters wanting to do someone in because they are pretty greedy and they want to get all of that person's riches. Yes, it is quite a creepy tale in its own right, but I wouldn't really classify this as a horror film. I would basically classify this as a psychological thriller in which the characters play off of each other, making it quite character-driven. And it's also peppered in with a fair amount of gallows humor, which I love in British films. On top of that, one thing I really have to give loads of kudos to this film is that it's not an overall somber experience. It manages to make the ride fun and accessible from beginning to end, and I swear, the ending can be a little bit messed up, and it kind of does show you that these characters kind of got what was coming to them, and let's just say that it's quite satisfying given the 92 minutes that it ran on. So overall, the story was a pretty good package from beginning to end. Yes, it is quite simple, but the writing was pretty tight, and I also like to say that this film does function as a period piece, given the era that this film was made, which was the 1970s, meaning that this was the mod era, in which you have a lot of young men and young women trying to dress as hip and cool as possible, and they basically have this type of youth culture revolution in which they want to rebel against any authority figure. So I have to say that this does work pretty well as a period piece. Yes, the main couple of Johnny and Jill are rather despicable, and I'll gladly talk about why when I talk about the characters, but I have to say that there was a certain charm to this film that made it kind of enjoyable, and it also had a little bit of that nostalgia quality in it. The cinematography was really solid, not just with a great use of location shots, given the fact that it makes me quite nostalgic over England, but also some of the tight claustrophobic shots, thus making this film quite versatile in its overall execution. And since this is a film from the 70s, they also managed to make a fine use of certain dream sequences as if though the characters came out from some music video. So overall, the cinematography was solid all throughout, and the music was equally solid. When you have such a fine mind like Carl Davis, then you can definitely bet that his compositions will stand out pretty well. The music screams 70s, with the usage of synthesizers and a little bit of the techno music at the time. There is no doubt that it does show its age. And of course, this film is really dated, not only in terms of its story, but also in its music, but there's a certain nostalgic charm to be found in everything in terms of its execution. The characters are quite interesting, even though some of them are quite simplistic, starting off with Johnny Talent. Now, on the surface, Johnny does appear to be kind and caring to his grandmother, but on the inside, he's callous, he is quite ill-tempered, and he definitely is very hot-headed, especially when it comes to his overall greed and wanting to get his inheritance from his grandmother. His overall actions may seem rather despicable, and he may seem like the type of character who prefers to do things before acting upon them, but there's also a certain charm to this character. He can be quite witty, which is basically the one thing that makes him slightly likable. But when it comes to his overall nasty nature, he does come off as one who wants to do away with his grandmother immediately and get his hands on the inheritance so that he can use it on his own terms. On top of that, Johnny is basically someone who is not employed nor in training. He's basically taking care of his grandmother, but he kind of uses that so that he can hopefully get his hands on her inheritance, even though his grandmother is still at the ripe age of 78. So overall, Johnny is a pretty despicable character in of his own rights. What with his callous nature, his hot-headedness, and his willingness not to work, he certainly does come off as rather despicable, but the only aspect about him that's rather positive is that he's at least witty. Jill Standish is the complete opposite of Johnny, as she manages to use her professionalism, given the fact that she's also a travel agent, to counterbalance between Johnny's rash and brash nature. Jill is a lot more composed, and she's basically the brains and the beauty behind Johnny's schemes. She's quite tactful in her scheming, and she manages to do so in a way that makes her very fascinating as a character. She's slightly more likable than Johnny, as she's a lot more resourceful, but even then, that doesn't excuse her for the awful deeds she's done, and we combine two of them together, they are pretty despicable people, even though they do have their fair share of positive attitudes, mostly found in their wittiness and how they manage to play off of each other. Yes, they're pretty despicable people, especially when it comes to their greed and how much they crave for Johnny's grandmother's earnings. And speaking of Johnny's grandmother, Alice, she's probably the only likable and pure character in this entire film. Mostly because she's blissfully unaware of what Johnny is actually doing, but at the same time, she just wants to make sure that Johnny is on the right path and doesn't give himself into delinquency. Grandma Alice basically presents herself as this unassuming old woman next door who has no ulterior motives and is basically the only good character in this film, which stars a couple of despicable young people. So even though the characters are rather simplistic, I have to say that there were some pretty interesting facets about them, especially when you go to the main villains of Johnny Talent and Jill Standish. As I stated before, their actions and how they are as people may be despicable, but there's something rather charming about the both of them that can be quite infectious. The acting is very well done, especially when you have Vanessa Howard on the helm as Jill Standish. Fresh from portraying the yandere girlie from Mumsy, Nanny, Sunny, and Girlie, here Howard presents herself as cool, calculating, and quite the smooth talker as Jill Standish. She managed to modulate her voice quite well with this role, making her quite seductive in her own way, and at the same time making her really charming. Which should be no surprise that she was also dubbed by Amicus Production as their Scream Queen, mostly because of the fact that she has been in a lot of horror titles. She managed to embody Jill's level-headed yet feisty personality so well that she was, in a word, extremely believable. Paul Nicholas was also quite well known for singing the role of Jesus from Jesus Christ Superstar, and also had a fine pop singing career, presents himself quite well as Johnny. He was able to make him brash and kind of callous, and at the same time made him quite the rambunctious person that he is, and he certainly made his portrayal come to life. He brought in a certain charm to Johnny, even though we the viewers are not supposed to like him just because of how callous and how cruel he tends to be, and also just how two-faced his character is. But nonetheless, I still have to give major props to Paul Nicholas for pulling it off so well. Mona Washbourne was warm and loving as Grandmother Alice. I mainly knew Mona Washbourne as Mrs. Pierce, the stern yet emphatic governess from the film adaptation of My Fair Lady. Here, she presents herself as the kind and unassuming Grandma Alice. With her sweet little old lady personality and how she managed to portray her with a lot of heart and a lot of great understanding of this character, she certainly made this character come to life, even though this is a pretty thankless role. We also had such fine portrayals, even though the characters were quite small, from the likes of Peter Copley, Peter Jeffrey, George A. Cooper, George Benson, and Angela Down. So overall, while the story can be quite simplistic, and even though the main characters are rather despicable in terms of their goals, and even though there's not a hell lot of depth to each of the characters, I still have to say that What Became of Jack and Jill was a solid experience to witness from beginning to end. I give What Became of Jack and Jill 3.5 out of 5 stars. Yes, there were elements from the story to the characters that were quite simplistic, and yes, this film was rather dated by today's standards, but its overall dark charm and how it managed to make this film quite fun without being so hoity-toity and so moody from beginning to end, even for a span of 92 minutes, was quite well done. And of course, the overall great performances done by Mona Washbourne, Vanessa Howard, and Paul Nicholas certainly made this film stand out pretty well. And for those of you who watched What Became of Jack and Jill, what did you think of it? Was there a particular moment in the film that you really, really liked? Did you feel like the actors stood on their own 2 feet so well, or did you feel like there was an aspect of the film that you were not a fan of? Comment below and let me know. Well, that's all for now. Be sure to tune in much later for my review of the Los Pitutos concert, which is shown at the Kugelbahn Berlin. So until then, have a great evening, everybody, and happy Halloween.